welcome everybody to the first of our winter webinars for the Craft Skills for Garden Conservation project that we've been working on for a couple of years now. We've managed to get Erasmus funding for a total of 9 webinars on different topics to do with craft skills for gardeners, and then 9 practical workshops. So hopefully you'll have seen the website and see a lot more information about it there. So welcome to all our attendees from all over Europe, it seems, and our speakers from Norway, Sweden and the UK. I'm very pleased that everybody is speaking in English. It's a huge privilege for me as an English speaker to attend these webinars and be able to follow everything. So I will try and speak slowly because a lot of you, I know, English is not your first language. So my name's Kate Nicoll. I was the head gardener on an 18th century estate in the UK that was owned by the National Trust. I then became a garden trainer for the National Trust for many years. So now I'm working as the workshop coordinator for this very exciting project, and we'll get started straight away. Here's the programme, and that's just the morning. It's a busy one, it's packed, and it's my job to try and keep everyone to time, including myself. As I mentioned, there'll be time for questions and answers, so please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll address those in the breaks. And we'll also be asking questions of you. We've got a few polls and questionnaires because we want to find out information about you and your gardens and what you want to learn from these webinars. And it's also to introduce the topic. So I confess that as a horticulture student, soil science was something that you actually raced through to get to the interesting part, the plants. But how little did I know? And for hundreds of years, people have really been studying soil and how important it is as the basis of everything we do as gardeners. And here's John Claudius Loudon, who was a Victorian or 19th century garden writer. And this is just one of hundreds of illustrations he made of just tools for digging and tilling the soil. And then this is a quote from a Second World War broadcaster on the BBC, who fended off almost every question from the listeners with "the answer lies in the soil." So if that's the case, what is the question? So mankind has been tilling the soil for millennia. This is actually back in 2008, the beginning of my restoration project at Attingham Park. And we have the historic sources going back that far to actually tell us everything really that we want to know about why we have been turning over the soil. And on the website, you'll find we've been putting together a list of historical sources going right back to ancient Rome. Just a quick one, Virgil wrote a whole epic poem on the subject called the Georgics, and it literally means on working the earth. And he reveals how much the Romans actually knew about which plants suited which type of soil. But it's only in the last 100 years or so that we've started to understand just how precious a resource our soil is, just as we're beginning to lose so much of it, and how we should actually be doing our best to conserve it. So this is the wonderful lady Eve Balfour, who published The Living Soil at the height of the Second World War, when Dig for Victory in the UK was at its height, and also at the same time synthetic fertilizers were a major part of the war effort. But it's only more recently that concerns have been listened to, and in fact last December there was the launch of the European Union soil strategy, which is a key driver, and they want to have 2030 all those strategic interests well and truly applied to our soil. But what does all this mean for the hands-on gardener? So these are my volunteers at Attingham Park 15 years ago, following the plough literally and preparing the soil for planting. And they were following a great tradition of the annual turnover of the soil. which has been a traditional ritual in every walled garden, certainly. And here are the walled gardeners of Attingham Park back in the 1930s, jovially digging away. I suspect they weren't really digging, it was just for the photograph. They'd have been spearing each other's toes otherwise. But, and there we are in 2012, doing exactly the same. This is my team of, interestingly, all female gardeners. Finally, women were allowed to get their hands on the soil. And we carried on for years. We actually deployed some other creatures to do the job for us, to do our dirty work, some wonderful Tamworth pigs who turned over the soil and fertilized it at the same time. And we loved the results that we came up with. But we soon began to realize that whilst our methods were authentic to the period, so this is a Georgian garden, so hand digging was the ritual really and the routine, they were becoming unsustainable because the weed seeds continued to emerge year after year. So we started listening to one of our speakers this afternoon, Charles Dowding, and we've been experimenting with the no-dig method, which started in 2018 in just one section of the garden. And you'll be hearing later about how a lot of heritage gardens, certainly in the UK, are switching to this method. So another theme we'll be hearing about this morning is that of growing in protected areas and particularly in pots, which is where we as gardeners get to create exactly the right growing conditions for what we want for our plants. So it's how we mix the composts, the growing media, as we should say, to make that distinction clear, both in the past and right now. So those are the topics that we'll be covering. So we're going to begin with getting back to the basics of what the soil, the actual soil, can tell us about our gardens. And Karen Lindblad is, excuse my pronunciation of all these names, I'm sure to have it wrong, I'm afraid. She's an archaeologist based in Sweden. And most archaeologists, it seems to me, with my untrained eye, dig away the soil to find the treasures buried beneath. But Karen actually studies the soil itself to see what it can tell us about the history of our gardens.